election comes after a record early vote turnout for Republicans last week. Chief Political Reporter Rudy Koski brings us a look at the numbers and the last-minute messages from some of the candidates.
This community center in Cedar Park is one of 20 polling locations in Williamson County for Tuesday's runoff election. The room is set for the arrival of voting machines and voters who will help decide which campaigns score a spot on the November ballot. Monday morning, the competition outside didn't involve politics, but pickleball. One of the players, Tom Hong, explained why he is sitting out the runoffs.
Just kind of see how things pan out. Yeah, so learn more about the candidates these next several months. Kind of make a more educated decision on this time to vote in November.
The count for early voting, which ended this past Friday, indicates a few Tuesday surprises are still in play. Republicans had the most early voters, with almost 830,000 casting a ballot last week. Democrats had a big drop-off after a big turnout in March, which at the time outpaced the GOP.
But it is on pace for a very high turnout runoff, which is atypical in these contests.
Brad Johnson with Texas Bullpen spoke with me about the runoff surge by Republicans.
But also you've got a high-profile clash for attorney general on both sides of the aisle. You have a heated contest for railroad commission, and then a lot of congressional seats open down ballot. And so just generally there's more interest, which tracks. What does that mean for these candidates? That's very much up to interpretation.
The GOP Senate nomination remains the main driver to the polls. Incumbent John Cornyn was in San Antonio Monday doing interviews after attending the annual Service Academy send-off. While Ken Paxton, he was on Fox and Friends to start his day.
Cornyn is needing to pull in voters who did not show up the first time around, and I think that number was, well below 10% in terms of the early vote itself. But, that could swing an election if margins are tight enough. But are they?
Initial early vote turnout numbers for the GOP runoff ballot indicate the bulk of those who voted last week also voted back in March. A county-by-county analysis also shows strong turnout in urban areas, several spots where Cornyn did better than Paxton in March.
There's things to take away, positive and negative, for the Cornyn camp and also the Paxton camp in terms of what we've seen with these early vote returns.
The Democrats have some interesting races also in this runoff. Anyone that you see right now that is benefiting from any kind of surge the Democrats are seeing?
Well, I think higher turnouts benefits the person who spent more money in a lot of these races. And unfortunately in a lot of these Democratic contests, there's a lot of spending parity, and you've got Vicki Goodwin running for lieutenant governor. She should be the nominee for the Democrats, but Marcos Velez has gotten a lot of money from various groups looking for an alternative to Goodwin in that slot. Nathan Johnson nearly won without a runoff in the March primary, but he did not escape that. He faces Joe Jaworski for attorney general. And, he spent more money, but not by a lot. So, this is really up in the air, I think.
The highly anticipated Republican primary runoff for U.S. Senate reaches its conclusion tonight. And for months, we've wondered if President Trump would back incumbent John Cornyn or Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. Last week, we finally got our answer as Trump endorsed Ken Paxton, calling him a true MAGA warrior. Alec Nolan talked to Dr. Joshua Blank from the Texas Politics Project to understand what this means for tonight's vote.
Josh, so President Trump endorsing Ken Paxton, were you surprised by this?
Well, this has been something that a lot of observers have been waiting for, and the question really has been whether or not President Trump would enter the race. It is somewhat surprising that he waited until early voting began to jump in, but nonetheless, it's something that we've all really been waiting for.
Do you think it makes a big difference, or do you think Ken Paxton was on his way to win regardless of what President Trump was going to do?
I think it's more likely that Trump's endorsement is an indication of the fact that Ken Paxton is likely to win this contest. Trump doesn't endorse candidates who don't appear likely to win. In a contest between Paxton and Cornyn, two longtime elected officials in Texas who voters know a lot about, it's unlikely that Trump's endorsement was going to push a lot of voters from their preferences.
It felt like, too, in his Truth Social post, he mentioned John Cornyn. He said he was a good man, but he said he wasn't always loyal to them. Is that a part of this as well, to say, hey, Ken Paxton is more in line with MAGA and loyalty than perhaps John Cornyn was?
Well, in addition to the advantages that Paxton entered the race with, one, sort of key feature of this election cycle, especially on the Republican side, is that the major currency of the Republican realm is loyalty to Donald Trump. And Paxton's loyalty to Donald Trump has never been questioned.
And looking at this as well, it seemed as though Cornyn on the day was a bit surprised by this, and then he cancels his campaign events on Wednesday. So what do you think the future is for him now? Where does he stand in all this?
Well, look, Cornyn is ultimately still a senior senator. He's still a leader in the party. And we're in a moment right now in which politics is a very active space. And one of the interesting things we're going to have to see is how Cornyn, especially if he doesn't end up being the party nominee, reacts and ultimately sees out his final term in office, especially with a president who just endorsed the person who's kicking him out of the job.
If you had to look at a crystal ball, do you think Paxton or Cornyn ultimately has the better chance of defeating the Democrat James Tallarico?
They both have a good chance because when we look at the data in Texas, we know that there are more Republican voters than there are Democrats. The conventional wisdom has been that Cornyn is the stronger candidate because he would appeal to more independent voters and maybe some Democrats who are just uncomfortable with Tallarico for one reason or another, given Cornyn's long tenure in the state. At the same time, in an election year that's looking to be challenging for Republicans, Paxton's closeness with the Republican base, and honestly, his closeness to really where the Republican Party stands right now, might give him the advantage at mobilizing Republicans in an election year in which it might be a little bit challenging.
Senate Majority Leader John Thune asked about this, and the question was sort of leading. They said, "Are you, how disappointed are you in this endorsement?" And he goes, "Look, I've made my thoughts clear on this," and it seemed as though he was frustrated. So, what do you think that says about the as you've mentioned, the senior senators that have known Cornyn for a long time and spent a lot of money on this campaign?
John Cornyn is a prolific fundraiser, and that's part of the reason he's risen in the ranks of Republican leadership. It also is a reflection of the fact that he is largely able to lean into his own networks to fund his campaigns. This is not something that Ken Paxton can rely on. And while Paxton will no doubt be well-resourced in the 2026 election if he turns out to be the nominee, he is going to need to lean on to the financial networks and resources of the party in a way that John Cornyn wouldn't. And in a tough election year for Republicans, or a likely tough election year for Republicans, these are resources spent in Texas that the party would rather be spending elsewhere.
We've seen some polls come out that show Paxton leading by double digits come Tuesday with the primary runoff. What do you anticipate, if you had to predict?
The reality is that trying to predict runoff elections is a fool's errand, because what we are going to see is a very, very low turnout amongst a very, strange conglomeration of the electorate, mixed of people who are drawn into this high-profile race, and really the high-profile races and the significant amount of spending that is going into it, but also, your usual highly engaged runoff voters who just don't tend to look like the overall electorate. So I think any predictions at this point would be foolish, but it does seem to be the case that, Paxton appears to be in a strong position at this point, and the question just is, if he wins, does he win by a few points or does he win by a comfortable margin?
Why does Governor Abbott refuse to make an endorsement?
There's no benefit for Governor Abbott to endorse in this race. And ultimately, he is the de facto leader of the state party. And while he has shown a willingness to endorse in some other contests, it's going to rely on him to be one of the unifying forces, if not individually, as a resource, both financially and really honestly as many resources, honestly, to the party overall. And so for him, endorsing just puts him in a tough position later if his chosen candidate doesn't become the nominee.
We started hearing people come out and saying, "Oh, is Texas, becoming more purple? Could Tallarico possibly win?" Is that a pipe dream?
Well, look, Texas is purple. Republicans were winning elections statewide by double-digit margins rather easily as recently as 10 or 12 years ago, and that's really no longer the case. There's a reason Republicans are concerned about who their nominee is going to be at the top of the ticket, and there's expectations that Republican candidates are going to be spending significant sums of money The question that sort of follows that is, is Texas turning blue? And the answer is no. Texas is not turning blue until a Democrat demonstrates that they can win statewide, which they haven't done in over 20 years. And so as of right now, yes, the state is competitive, it's purple, but it's still solidly Republican until we have an election that proves otherwise.
I'm Atiana San Miguel. Thank you for watching our story. If you'd like to see more like it, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, be sure to watch us weekday mornings at 7 and 11 a.m. on KCWX. Bye. See you on the next one.